Stephen Van Tassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek podcast with Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Van Tassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Van Tassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Hope you've had a great week. My week was okay so far, but I'm kind of in a new week now here on recording on a Sunday. So I've had to do a couple shows today, so try to get some off into the kitty, but I hope your week went well. I've got some training I need to get provided in this coming week, so I'll be doing some traveling. So if you're interested, of course, in having me train in your particular area, whether in person or through a webinar, you could definitely reach out to me. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to our channel, ring the bell so you can be made aware of any new shows that are coming along. If you don't like YouTube, you can certainly see my podcast up on Rumble. Just go to Wildlife Control Consultant and the podcasts will be located there. If you have questions, comments, criticisms, maybe a show that you'd like to have, perhaps you'd like to be on the show, we'd love to hear from you. We love doing interviews. You can reach me again at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Do take a few moments as well and join us on Facebook. You can visit us on our Facebook page at Pest Geek Podcast and join the family, join the revolution, as Franklin calls it. So we'd love to hear from you there as well. This week, I thought I would talk a little bit about photography. Those of you who've been following the podcast know that I am just crazy about photographs. The reason is because it is so hard to get good ones. And when you're involved in training such as I am, good quality photos are absolutely essential. So I am always in the market to purchase the use rights of photos. I have a whole podcast on sort of the copyright side of things. I'm not a lawyer. I don't say that I am a lawyer, but in terms of the difference between ownership of a photo and the right to use a photo. I typically don't buy ownership rights of photos, although I have. I am looking primarily to purchase the use of the photos so that I can use it, so you can then sell it to somebody else if you so wish. And of course, I'm always taking photographs, but one of the challenges about taking good quality photographs is the issue of scale. Now, certainly you want your photos to be crisp. Let me pull my PowerPoint up here and make that available. Let me just bring that up. So let me go up a little bit more. All right, so here we are, the problem with photos, and that is when you see this particular picture. I hope you're not driving at this particular point, but when you see this particular skull, the question, how big is it? So this is the challenge when we're taking photos. Now, sometimes it doesn't matter, right? If you're taking some area shots per se, but as we become a more mature industry, understand you're going to be involved sooner or later, probably with some legal issues. If not necessarily in a courtroom, you're probably going to be involved in things that are requiring you to evaluate maybe an insurance claim. Maybe the insurance claim is being made against you. And when you were taking photos, you are taking photos, right? Hope you are before you do your work and after you do your work. But if you are taking photos, how do you ensure that the photos are going to have enough quality to them that are going to hold up in court? Now, that's not going to be an everyday occurrence. And I'm not suggesting that every single time you take a photo, you need to be taking it as thinking you're going to be in court. But it doesn't hurt to do it a few times, right? And one of the challenges with photos is that it's hard to determine scale, particularly when you're doing close-ups on a photograph, on an object, I should say. You're taking a close-up maybe of a track, maybe of a scat, maybe of a gnaw mark, maybe of damage that has occurred. You want to show the client that there's been some chewed wires, perhaps. How do you show scale to show how big or how small something is? Well, like for this skull, I just have a look at it. How big is this skull? Is this of a vole or is it of a beaver? How do you tell? Because you can see that it's damaged. It's actually kind of a fossilized skull somewhat, or so it's not, how big is it? We don't know. So what if I did this? Does that make a difference in terms of how big it is? Now you have something to compare it with. Now you know that the length of this skull is, give or take about 2 centimeters. That means this skull is less than an inch long. That's from like the tip of the nose to the back of the base of the head. It's less than an inch, but would you be able to tell that from the photo if I just go back to this one? Well, no. And you're like, well, Stephen, you can kind of figure it out. I know. Look, my point here is that we need to be raising our game a little bit. Not for every photo. I'm not trying to make this the end all and be all. No. But I'm suggesting that there are going to be times that you need to be thinking about taking photos. If you're not looking to sell those photos or even be involved in a lawsuit, which isn't always your choice, right? What if you're trying to create your own training material and you're trying to create a training, like an in-house training for your workers, so that you can get them up to speed to help them distinguish between a mouse track or a rat track? How are you going to do that without scale? For those of you in the pest control field, how are you going to help them understand the relative size of insects from a PowerPoint without showing them some semblance of scale? Now, there are various ways to do this. So, for example, here's another example of the problem of scale. Now, you all know that a penny is not the same size as a quarter. However, in this particular slide that I've presented to you, I've basically made the penny about the same size as the quarter. And we know that's not true. So you can see again the problem of scale when we're dealing with photographs, and why it's important and helpful at times. Not for every photo. Sometimes it doesn't matter what the size is. We're trying to show something else. But if you're trying to show something like relative damage, or you're trying to distinguish between, is this a raccoon track? Is this something else? And that when you're sending this photograph, maybe you're trying to take a photograph of something and you need some assistance to help you identify it. Well, I get photos that people send to me, and sometimes it's hard to determine what it is because there's no scale in the object. I don't know how big is that scat because the person didn't put anything down for scale. Now, one of the cheap ways you can do scale for photographs, it's not perfect, of course, but it's certainly a far cry better than nothing, and that is simply use coinage. You probably have coins in your wallet all the time. I always suggest using a penny because when you're near scat, that way you don't have to pick it back up again, right? You don't want to be touching that. So here's what these sizes actually are. This information comes from the U.S. Treasury. Now, whatever country you're in, it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be American money here, right? But whether you're a Canadian or maybe out in the islands or in Australia, South Pacific, whatever the case may be, your country has metal currency, and you just can determine, ask your country's treasury to find, what sizes are there, and these sizes come again directly from the U.S. Treasury. So you can see how a quarter is almost an inch wide. Not quite, but it's pretty gosh darn close. So it's better than nothing to show you how something is in terms of scale. That is about almost an inch wide, where a dime is a little over 7/10 of an inch wide. And of course, a nickel is a little smaller than that. And then of course, a penny, the beauty of a penny is it's exactly 3/4 of an inch wide. So if nothing else, this can be very helpful for you when you're putting it next to a track, when you're putting it next to a scat, to show what something is relative to what something else, a standardized object. I've suggested, or maybe I've stolen it from somebody else. I know one person I heard suggested that you use a dollar bill even for if you want something a little longer, because again, a dollar bill is going to have a standard size width and length. Now, if you don't want to use currency, you can always use a ruler. Now, a ruler is great because a ruler, it's again a standardized object. You can measure something down to some incredible fine levels. Problem is it's not always easy to carry. Now, if you're working on the job and you have a toolkit with you, you can have a ruler in there, pull out your ruler or pull out your tape measure and have something that shows you size and length, right? So that could be a very powerful scale for you. But again, you got to carry it with you. And sometimes you find beautiful photos, perhaps when you're inspecting, perhaps when you're doing something else. And did you carry a ruler with you? Chances are, I would suspect that many of you haven't. This is one of the advantages, of course, with I use a Leatherman myself. But I always suggest one of my criticisms of this particular Leatherman is that, the measurements aren't on the outside of the handle where the Super Tool Leatherman does, but this one you've got to open it up and then you have the scale listed right here to measure something. But, if you measure how long this is, you can then use that as an issue of scale. But again, you'd have to measure that because I'm not sure all Leathermans are the same length, right? So however that would be for you. But the point is, at least it's better than nothing. At least you could always go back and say, well, I know I was using Leatherman Surge and I can measure its length. There you go. Okay, that's another option for you. But having a ruler can be really helpful if you're going to be carrying it with you all the time, or if you're purposely taking photographs, then you'd want to obviously come prepared. But unfortunately, we're in a lot of situations where we see beautiful photos of wildlife damage or tracks or scat, and we don't have a scale with us. And this is where I came up with this particular idea, where I had these cards created. Now these are credit card size objects. I have one here, and I carry one in my wallet all the time, so that wherever I am, I have the ability to whip this out and take a picture with it. And, if I lose it, it's pretty durable. It's made out of plastic. It's got inches and centimeters on both sides, so it's the same thing, flip side. And it's made black and white, and there you go. It's all I'm ready to go because I have this in my wallet, and I carry my wallet obviously all the time, which I suspect you do as well. But certainly it's a whole lot easier to carry this than to carry a ruler such as you see in the photograph there. So you have options for how you're dealing with scale. You could use coinage, you can use a ruler, you can use a standard object that you're always carrying with you, like a Leatherman. Or you can purchase one of these and carry it with you as well. These are going to be available on my website should you care to have it. My point is that think about scale when you're taking photographs. So we've talked before about the importance of making sure your photographs are crisp, that they're not fuzzy because you've held your cell phone camera really still and you've been deliberate about your photograph. You're making sure that you've framed it properly. You don't have improper shadows and things like that. You can look at that previous podcast I've done. But scale is something that's an important element as well, particularly when you're doing close-ups. Let me give you another slide here to think about here. Here we have some vole damage on the left. Now I know it's vole damage. Maybe even you can tell that it's vole damage. But how big is it? Right? You can probably guess. But notice how I have my card pictured in the right one. Now we know how wide those particular trails are because we have a standard sized object to compare it to that has measurements on it. So something for you to think about, something that I would encourage you if you're looking to develop training for yourself, because if you hired me to put together a training PowerPoint for your staff or something, I'm going to need photos because you probably don't want to pay me for using my photos, right? So this is something you'd have to think about, and that is if you don't have photos, how do you have this built that you're something that you would own and control, right? And so I think one of the challenges, especially for those of you who are new to the wildlife control industry, is that you think you'll never need something. It's the same thing when we were in high school, right? Oh, I don't need to know calculus, or I don't need to know geometry. What am I going to use this for? And then you become an adult and you're like, oh, well, maybe it really would have been helpful if I had some calculus. I could have maybe gotten a different job. Or if I was better at geometry and gone into trig, I could have been a machinist or something, right? So there are things we don't always know what we need before we need it. And so you may not be thinking about your company getting big enough to have employees, but maybe you need to start thinking about that, specifically when things are slow and you have the time to be taking quality photographs until your business begins to pick up. When it gets to a point, this is the problem with a lot of guys who are, much bigger companies, is they're often too busy to take these great photos. And, then several years later, they regret it. They won't admit it, of course. They're too manly for that. But they'll regret it. Like they'll have photos of mice with their teeth on electrical wires and stuff. And I'll ask people, did you take a photo? Oh, no, I didn't take a photo of it. Why? How common is that? Right? Things for you to think about. And then, of course, the whole legal side of things. If you're in a situation, perhaps you've been called in to clean up someone else's mess because they didn't do the job right. Are you taking good quality photos there? Are you using objects for scale? How big was the gap that was left? Is that going to be able to be told by the photograph without an object in it for scale? Something to think about. Again, you can pick these up on my website or use one of the other items I suggested. I do have one more thing I needed to point out for you before I let you go. And that is, you can always if you want to really take your photographs up a notch, you can get these forensic style scale markers or rulers. Now, I don't make any money off this forensic source place. I just Googled a particular place looking for rulers. But you can see how they typically have in a L shape. Some have stickers, adhesives with them. They come in different colors depending on for contrast. But you can see some even come in rolls here. But some of these are going to be small. Some of these are going to be larger. I have a few of these hinged reference scales. You can actually flip them over. They'll be black and white on one side, white and black on the other, where they're showing you this remarkable contrast. And so by having them hinged, you can then manipulate. That way you're able to show things like width and length of an object as well. But again, they're not the easiest things to carry around. But if you're in a situation where you really need to take good quality photos for maybe some sort of a lawsuit, maybe an insurance claim or something, you'd probably want to step up your game and have some of these items hanging around the shop so that you could use those if necessary. But otherwise, certainly what I have at my store here, you can get one of these cards and buy it that way. So that's pretty much it for today. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife is part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Do take a few moments, if you would. Join us on Facebook with the Pest Geek podcast family, where you can talk about your triumphs and trials. We'd also love to hear from you in terms of your thoughts about the show. wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. You can definitely reach out to me there. Perhaps you would want to be on the show. You can talk to me then as well. And then lastly, of course, this is the Living the Wildlife podcast. You may wonder, why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.